I know that a lot of you who watch my videos are of the opinion that the information you're getting through the mainstream media about what's happening in Venezuela and Colombia is the gospel truth and totally believable, and you should just take it as what you should believe. You think that because a certain election went a certain way, that all of a sudden the U.S. is now all goodness and light, and everything that it's done since 1960 should be forgotten. I love my country, but I don't trust my government. And in today's video, I'm going to explain for you, step by step, what has happened in Venezuela and the role Colombia has played. I know a lot of you are very familiar with this, Cloward Piven. You have associated it with the attempt to destroy the United States. Well, the United States is still here, and regardless of any perceived attack, it never happened. But what has happened is a sovereign nation in South America has come to the verge of collapse. And here's how it happened. The truth. Not the mainstream media version. The real truth. I'm going to use maps to try to explain this to you, because it's a situation that's been long in the making, and there's a lot of different parties. Now, there's some green dots up here, and we're going to use those to represent the vendors of goods and services in Venezuela for the poor and elderly and disabled. For years, Colombian refugees, prior to this issue in Venezuela, have fled to Venezuela and taken advantage of these, primarily because of the U.S.-financed and U.S.-caused drug war in Colombia. There's two parties fighting in Colombia. The black dots represent U.S.-backed, U.S.-financed paramilitary death squads that have been there since the 60s, enforcing U.S. policy and protecting big corporations like Dole and Del Monte, Big Pharma, Big Oil as well. There's actually oil in Colombia. The red represents the people in Colombia that weren't having any of it. There was a group called the FARC and a group called the ELN. They are what the U.S. has categorized as left-wing militants. Now, as far as organization and power and the ability to fight a war, these disparate paramilitary groups really stood no chance one-on-one with the FARC or the ELN. That's why the U.S. had to continue to send $500 million down there every single year to continue to finance them, to complete the drug flow, and to maintain control of the country. Now the problem is these little blue dots. These blue dots are the people of Colombia, the refugees that these paramilitaries have tried to force into service. They prostitute their daughters, they conscript their sons, they burn their houses. Unless they grow coca for the paramilitaries, they have no choice. And the vast majority of them run to Venezuela and have for years. So that's the setup. You see, the reason a lot of these areas over here, these vendors, would have price-controlled and quantity-controlled goods is simply because of the U.S.-financed drug war. What happened is they were actually fairly capitalistic for a while, but the problem was all of these people would come in here and they would buy everything up, and they would run out. And what happens in a capitalist society when that happens? The prices of everything go through the roof. Well, these people are subsistence farmers, and a lot of them are natives, and they don't have the ability to absorb that, and people were starving. So they kept the prices down, and they tried to keep them supplied as much as they could, and for a long while it actually worked. There were problems, but nobody had to pay these exorbitant prices, black market prices. So you with me so far? We have a U.S.-financed war. We have a group of people from Colombia trying to mitigate it. We have refugees here, and we have a country over here trying to do the very best it can to help out the situation in Colombia. All right, this is page 1. Page 2. Now, Enter Santos, the peace deal that he negotiated with the left-wing paramilitaries. You see, there was the U.S., of course, financed this big anti-FARC, anti-ELN campaign, calling them the terrorists, and saying they should lay down their arms and they're the ones that should stop fighting, and only reporting the atrocities that they would ascribe to them, and not saying anything about the death squads that we were financing. So eventually they did. The FARC laid down its arms, but not the ELN. The ELN wasn't buying the bullshit. And of course nobody asked for a peace deal with the paramilitaries because the Colombian and U.S. government denied they even existed, when it was clear they did. That's the whole reason for the existence of the FARC and ELN. So when this 2015-16 peace deal happened, and the FARC and ELN laid down their arms, the ones that disagreed with laying down their arms, most of them fled to Venezuela. But the ELN still operated, and that represents these few little red dots here. But this gave these paramilitaries free run over the whole country. And this is when production of cocaine skyrocketed. 2015-16 in Colombia, huge numbers. But the problem is now a lot of these refugees that had worked with and collaborated and helped the ELN out these paramilitaries were now being slaughtered by the thousands and conscripted. So they ran permanently to Venezuela. This further taxed the system, because now it wasn't just a part-time thing. It was a full-on exodus of refugees from Colombia to Venezuela. I know the story is you think it's going the other way. It is now, but not at this time. So this is what happened, and the U.S.-backed paramilitaries started absolutely enriching the Sinaloan cartels. They shipped from the Pacific coast of Colombia to the Pacific coast of Mexico, and this is when the problem started in late 2014, 15, 16. You with me so far? This peace deal caused a nightmare. Now, here's the scam to take down Venezuela. Once the paramilitaries had free reign to do this, what they did is they started entering Venezuela under the guise of being refugees themselves, flush with a ton of cash provided by the United States converted into Colombian currency. They started massively buying up all of the goods and services in this area, leaving none for the population. They would take all of those goods, go across the Colombian border, and wait. Well, these people had no choice. The Venezuelan government couldn't keep up. So what did they do? In fact, the Venezuelan military entered Colombia twice trying to stop this, and you can look that up for yourself. I've reported on it. But what they did was these people had no choice. They would come over here to get these goods that had been basically stolen from Venezuela. They were paid for, yes, but they were basically being bought up for the purposes of terror. So these people would then they only took, these black markets only accepted bolivars or US dollars. So they would take the bolivars that the people were bringing, okay, and they would sell the bolivars, the actual paper currency, to the cartels. The paper itself was incredibly valuable because it wasn't just any kind of paper. It was the same paper they print US dollars on. And they would take the paper, strip the ink, and they would then turn it into counterfeit US dollars. And everybody knows the Colombians have the ability to do this. Now, this wasn't going unnoticed. Okay? They were charging triple and quadruple, of course, and if they came with US dollars, the exchange rate was ridiculous. So they were systematically destroying the Venezuelan economy. There's an investigation down there that details all this called the Manos de Papel. Literally means the hands of paper. Now, what do these dots represent? Well, the ELN and the dissident FARC were like, okay, they were wise to the scam. They knew what was going on. So they start to rearm, and the ELN starts basically the war back up. But what does the U.S. say? Oh, it's all the terrorists' fault and the leftists' fault and all this stuff. So they were sending massive amounts of wealth out of Venezuela into Colombia, taking the paper currency and making it literally impossible to get. The Venezuelan government only had one choice: print more money. Because literally the physical money was being taken out of the country. And I've shown videos of this too, talking about this criminal dollar equivalent, parallel dollar, that was being used down here, just to get this goods and services that the Venezuelans were trying to give to the poor and the elderly and the needy and the refugees, ironically, from Colombia. Well, here's where we are now. The ELN, now reinforced with the FARC, who are actual real-deal soldiers or real-deal military, kicked out these paramilitaries, these U.S.-backed, Colombian-backed paramilitaries, and drove them back to the Pacific coast. And they have now cut the country in two completely. They're also operating in conjunction with the Venezuelan military over on this side of the border to make sure this shit doesn't happen again, but the damage has been done. These little blue and green dots here represent the refugees and the people of Venezuela that have stood up communes now. Because the damage has been done, the spiral has started, there was no way to stop it. This is only a country of 38 million people. It's smaller than California. It can only absorb so much U.S. attack. And remember, the U.S. has been doing this for decades. They've been sending money down there, that $500 million, $500 million, $500 million down there every year. This was a coordinated strike. They overwhelmed the system. Now over here, you can actually read about how the Sinaloans and these paramilitaries are now having a finger-pointing contest, and you can read about the chop houses and the torturing and everything else that's going on. And Colombians, okay, there are Venezuelans coming into Colombia now and trying to regain their lives, regain some sense of normalcy. But there's only so much the ELN can do. And the Colombian government, Colombian U.S. government, is now, of course, trying to maintain and do the cover story, and they're thinking about closing their border. Of course, I put the arrows up here because the U.S. has realized their plan has failed, and now they're going to try to do it with military intervention. Big Oil has already done its part by attempting to seize Venezuelan assets through Aruba, Curacao, all through the Caribbean, forcing the Venezuelans to bring all of their tankers back to Venezuelan waters. And of course, here they had to launch their massive globalist disinformation campaign. Sanction the country, criminalize investment, and threaten U.S. military action. Meanwhile, the real victims are just trying to get by. But they're doing it. And the government is arming them because they're waiting for this U.S. action. So this is what's happened. 4 maps. They had the war. They had the collapse. But this time somebody fought back. And now the U.S. doesn't like it. Not one freaking bit. And don't get me wrong, I don't blame U.S. soldiers or servicemen for doing or following orders. For what they're going to have to do, and the ones that are down there now are just doing their duty. But do understand, and this is the same issue with Fitzgerald, there's a difference between the average everyday soldier, serviceman, airman, marine, guardsman, and the brass on high that plays these games. And statistics don't lie. There's the 2000s. Here's when Chavez took power. No giant problem, no giant problem. All of a sudden, a problem. The peace deal. The U.S. starts to become an oil exporter. And we see the problem. Right here, this yellow one, this guy here was about as U.S. friendly as you could get. And you can look him up. This is Jaime Lusinski. So was Rodriguez. And this is statistics on coca cultivation. This is where it's all grown. Over here. This is where the right-wing U.S. paramilitaries operate. This has more to do with mountains than it does anything else. But you never heard, and like I've said, I'll leave with this. The big problem with drugs and the big problem with coca cultivation was never Venezuela. It's Peru and Colombia. And those are two, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. Mexico gets $200 million a year from us. Colombia gets $500 million a year from us. Let me say this again. Peru gets $70 million a year from us. Mexico gets $200 million a year. Colombia gets $500 million a year. So a grand total combined $600 million a year, almost $700 million a year, between those three countries. And they get more aid from the U.S. than every other country in Latin America combined, and they account for 99% of the drug problem. Peace. The peace deal. It's a bunch of crap. Don't believe what you're being told. It's just this all over again, just in another part of the world. Like, share, subscribe.